I've always been fascinated by old houses, and the one I bought in Denver was no exception. Nestled at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street, it stood as a relic of a bygone era. The house, with its Victorian architecture and intricate woodwork, exuded a sense of history and mystery. Its tall, narrow windows seemed to watch my every move, and the creaking floorboards told stories of the past with each step I took. Despite its charm, there was something undeniably eerie about the place. The overgrown garden, the peeling paint, and the ivy creeping up the walls all contributed to an unsettling atmosphere. But what intrigued me the most was the basement door. Unlike any other door in the house, it was secured with heavy, rusty chains and an old padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. From the moment I moved in, that door held a sinister allure. Why was it locked so tightly? What secrets lay behind it? I would often find myself standing in front of it, my hand hovering over the padlock, my mind racing with possibilities. Yet, despite my curiosity, a deep-rooted sense of dread kept me from trying to open it. Every creak and groan of the house seemed to emanate from behind that door, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the basement was better left undisturbed. At night, as the wind howled outside and shadows danced across the walls, I would lie in bed, my thoughts consumed by the basement and its mysterious contents. Little did I know, the answers I sought would soon come to light in the most terrifying way imaginable. It started with small things. First, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. A flickering light here, an inexplicable draft there. But soon, the occurrences became impossible to ignore. Objects would move from their original places, doors would creak open on their own, and I would hear faint whispers echoing through the hallways at night. One evening, as I was preparing to go to bed, I noticed a chill in the air. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the old house settling, but the feeling persisted. Lying in bed, I found it difficult to fall asleep. My mind kept drifting back to the basement door and the mysteries it held. I couldn't help but wonder if these strange events were connected to whatever was behind those chains. As the hours ticked by, I finally drifted into a restless slumber, my dreams filled with shadows and unidentifiable sounds. I woke with a start in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m., the witching hour. A sudden urge to check the basement door washed over me, and before I knew it, I was out of bed and tiptoeing down the creaky stairs. The closer I got to the basement, the colder it became. My breath came out in visible puffs as I reached the door. To my horror, the chains were lying in a heap on the floor, and the door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Panic surged through me. I should have run back to my room, called someone, anyone, but curiosity got the better of me. What was down there? What had released those chains? My mind was a whirlwind of questions, but the fear was real and palpable. I stood frozen, my hand trembling as I reached for the flashlight I had brought with me. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the top of a staircase descending into the abyss. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, the old wooden stairs creaking ominously beneath my weight. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. I had no idea what awaited me at the bottom, but I was about to find out. With each step deeper into the basement, the air grew heavier, almost oppressive. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on the damp, stone walls. The smell of mildew was thick, mingling with something far more foul, an odor that I couldn't quite place but filled me with an instinctual sense of dread. The basement was larger than I had anticipated. Ancient, wooden shelves lined the walls, cluttered with dusty jars and broken tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains, and the floor was littered with debris, making each step a cautious endeavor. The further I ventured, the more the walls seemed to close in, as if the basement itself was alive and breathing, watching my every move. As I moved the flashlight around, it landed on a curious sight. A small, narrow door at the far end of the room. Unlike the others, this door was made of metal and seemed newer, almost out of place in the decrepit basement. My heart skipped a beat. What was behind it? The sense of foreboding was nearly overwhelming, but curiosity had a firm grip on me. I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. To my surprise, it swung open easily, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward. The walls of the tunnel were rough, carved directly from the earth, and the air was colder, more pungent. As I stepped inside, the sense of dread intensified, wrapping around me like a shroud. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the darkness ahead impenetrable even with the flashlight. Strange markings were etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, but they sent shivers down my spine. The further I walked, the more I noticed subtle signs that something was terribly wrong. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and every so often, I could swear I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that grew louder the deeper I went. Then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, the space opened up into a cavernous room. My flashlight revealed a grotesque tableau, old, decaying furniture, remnants of what looked like ritualistic objects, and in the center, a large, ominous pit. The air around it felt thick with malevolence, and a faint, eerie glow emanated from its depths. My blood ran cold as I realized that this wasn't just an old, abandoned basement. This was a gateway to something far more sinister. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, a sudden, bone-chilling sound echoed through the chamber. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the pit itself. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I knew I had to get out of there before whatever was down there decided to come up. Turning on my heel, I fled back through the tunnel, the whispers now a cacophony of voices urging me to leave. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the flashlight flickered wildly as I sprinted back up the stairs, through the basement, and into the relative safety of my house. Slamming the basement door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. One thing was certain. I had uncovered something that was never meant to be found, and I feared the horrors I had glimpsed in that underground world were only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, jolted me awake, my mind racing back to the horrors I had glimpsed in the basement. When dawn finally broke, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it did little to quell the unease gnawing at my insides. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house changed drastically. It was as if the malevolence I had encountered underground had seeped into the very walls. Shadowy figures flitted at the edge of my vision, vanishing whenever I turned to look. At night, the eerie noises returned, louder and more insistent. A chorus of disembodied whispers, echoing growls, and chilling, unexplainable sounds that kept me on edge. My attempts to make sense of what I had seen only deepened my dread. I researched the history of the house, combing through old records and local legends. Stories of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and strange occurrences linked to the property surfaced, painting a picture of a place long haunted by darkness. But none of it could explain the true nature of the underground horrors. One night, as I sat in my study, poring over ancient texts and maps, a loud bang reverberated through the house. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized it was coming from the basement. The chains I had hastily refastened were now broken again, the door once more ajar. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my flashlight and descended the stairs, determined to confront whatever had been unleashed. The basement seemed even darker and more oppressive than before. As I stepped inside, my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that twisted and writhed as if alive. The tunnel loomed ahead, its entrance like the gaping maw of some terrible beast. Steeling myself, I ventured back into the subterranean world. This time, the horrors were unmistakable. Shadowy figures materialized from the walls, their forms indistinct but menacing. They whispered in voices that chilled my very soul, speaking in languages I could not understand. The air was thick with an almost palpable sense of dread, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. As I reached the cavernous room with the ominous pit, the eerie glow had intensified. The shadows gathered around it, swaying in a macabre dance. I could feel their malevolent gazes upon me, their intentions clear. They did not want me here. My mind struggled to comprehend the sheer terror of it all, but the primal part of me understood. I was in grave danger. In the midst of this chaos, a realization struck me. This pit, this underground world, was not merely a haunting. It was a gateway, a conduit through which these horrors could reach the surface world. The growl I had heard before now resonated with a new urgency, as if something deep within the pit was awakening, ready to breach the barrier between worlds. I knew I had to act. Fumbling with the flashlight, I backed away slowly, my mind racing with desperate plans to seal the basement for good. But the shadows were relentless, closing in around me, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. It was as if they sensed my intent and sought to prevent my escape. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke into a run, sprinting back through the tunnel, up the stairs, and out of the basement. Slamming the door shut, I dragged every piece of furniture I could find in front of it, creating a makeshift barricade. My hands trembled as I worked, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally paused, exhausted and terrified, I realized the full scope of the threat. Those horrors were not content to remain underground. They wanted out, and if I didn't find a way to stop them, they would soon be free to wreak havoc on the surface world. I sat, breathless and trembling, staring at the makeshift barricade I had thrown together. The basement door, now obscured by heavy furniture, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The shadows and whispers that had pursued me from below were still vivid in my mind, their presence an unshakable weight on my chest. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, but where could I go that they wouldn't follow? Suddenly, the house groaned as if in pain, and I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone, keys, and a few essentials, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. As I bolted out the front door, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but a lingering sense of dread followed me like a shadow. I jumped into my car and sped away, not daring to look back. Driving through the quiet streets of Denver, my mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened and what could happen next. The horrors I had unleashed were not merely confined to the basement. Their malevolence was palpable, and I feared they could extend their reach beyond the house. The ancient texts I had studied hinted at such possibilities, and the local legends were filled with tales of inexplicable occurrences linked to the property. As I drove, the radio crackled to life with a burst of static before settling into a clear signal. The voice of a local news reporter filled the car, recounting strange incidents that had begun to plague the neighborhood. Reports of unexplained shadows, cold spots, and eerie noises echoed my own experiences. My heart sank as I realized the horrors were already spreading. I found refuge in a nearby motel, the blandness of the room a stark contrast to the nightmarish events I had just endured. But even here, far from the house, the feeling of being watched persisted. I knew I couldn't simply run away and hope the horrors would stay contained. They were out there, and I had to find a way to stop them. In the days that followed, I sought out experts in the occult and paranormal, desperate for answers. I delved deeper into the history of the house, uncovering more disturbing details about its past. It had been built on the site of an old, forgotten cemetery, and the basement had long been rumored to be a gateway to another realm, a conduit for dark forces. Armed with this knowledge, I knew I had to return. The thought of facing those horrors again filled me with dread, but I couldn't let them continue to spread unchecked. I gathered supplies, salt, iron, protective charms, and formulated a plan to seal the basement for good. It would be dangerous, and I didn't know if I would succeed, but I had to try. Returning to the house was the hardest thing I had ever done. The oppressive atmosphere was worse than before, and the shadows seemed to reach out for me as I approached the basement door. With every step, I felt the weight of malevolent eyes upon me, but I pressed on, driven by the need to protect others from the horrors I had unwittingly unleashed. I worked quickly, spreading salt and placing iron objects around the basement entrance. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, as if the house itself was fighting back. My hands shook as I recited the incantations I had learned, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of eerie noises. As I finished, a sudden silence fell. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and for a moment, I dared to hope that it had worked. But the shadows still lingered, and the sense of being watched remained. I knew this was only the beginning of a long battle. I left the house once more, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the horrors were not fully contained. The threat was ongoing, a dark presence that would continue to haunt the area. But I also felt a renewed sense of determination. I had faced the darkness and survived, and I would continue to fight it, to keep the horrors at bay. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old house in Denver stood silent, its secrets buried for now, but I knew the shadows were still there, waiting. The fight was far from over, and I would be ready. Enjoyed it? Give a like and spread the terror. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any scares. Join our dark community.